Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Nisha Lawson, Membership Services Coordinator for the Ohio Fire Chiefs Association. Thank you for joining us for this morning's webinar, NFPA 1500 Update 2018 edition, presented by Battalion Chief David Burnsweg of the Columbus Division of Fire. If you have any questions during or after the presentation, you can type them into the question box, or you can raise your hand as seen over on your control panel. We will get to as many as we have time for today. And with that being said, I will now turn it over to Chief Burnsweg.
Good morning, and thank you all for tuning in this morning. On this, my name is Dave Burnsweg. I'm the Battalion Chief in Columbus, Ohio. Currently working out in emergency services, although I was previously the safety officer. I was the Chief of Health and Safety for our department, and I'm the Director of Health and Safety for the Ohio Association of Professional Firefighters. In addition to that, I sit on a couple different NFPA committees. One is the Committee for Occupational Safety and Health, which has 7 documents under its umbrella, including NFPA 1500, which we'll be going over today. The other technical committee that I sit on is the Technical Committee for Respiratory Protective Equipment, and there's a little bit of overlap, obviously, when we're talking about protective equipment, but we'll be focusing on 1500 solely today. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk us through the changes to the standard chapter by chapter. A lot of significant changes we made this time. Probably the most significant things that we're addressing in the current edition is contamination control, dealing with cancer prevention and controlling contaminants from the fire ground. So that's a big piece of it. That actually we added a whole chapter for, chapter 14, so that's the last piece we'll cover, although it's, as you'll see, it's interspersed throughout the document as well. We also addressed several other significant issues that have been going on. One was had to do with exterior riding positions on apparatus, which was permitted in the wildland standard, and several other changes as we'll get to here. So in chapter 1, chapter 1 is the administration chapter. That's really where the scope and purpose of the document are. Usually there are not big changes in this portion of the document, although this time we did add the term wellness to it and expanded the document to include the term wellness. It had always been covered in chapters 11, 12, and 13 with the medical portion, as well as atypical stressful events, which used to be PTSD. So now wellness is now incorporated into it. We also added, this is pretty significant, we added fire investigators and fire inspectors to the document. So while most fire departments have their own investigators or fire inspectors, they were not covered under any health and safety document. And with the addition in covering the contamination control and cancer prevention, certainly this was important for these folks as well. And I skip over chapter 2 and 3. Chapter 2 is just reference publications. Those get updated with every edition of the standard, and so those all have new dates. Chapter 3 is the definitions, and as we have definitions that are that were updated or added to the document as they relate to a specific portion of the chapter, that's where you're going to see them this morning. So in chapter 4, which is the Fire Department Administration chapter, a couple changes here. We added, as I mentioned, products of combustion, carcinogens, contaminants to the fire department risk management plan, and risk reduction strategy and policy. And as you can see, at the end of each of these bullets that you'll see throughout the document, you'll see what part of the section or what section in the document these are located. Also, we have a requirement now that the fire department shall provide orientation training to members of the Occupational Safety and Health Committee, and that products of combustion, carcinogens, and contaminants, again, shall now be part of the data collection system. So here's something, just an example of what we're doing, how we're incorporating that in Columbus. As part of our NFPA, our National Fire Incident Reporting System, with our software, we were able to add basically another field or another option. So the last slide or the last box you get to when you're doing a fire report in Columbus is during this incident response, were any of the following hazards present? and it's basically lists all those things there on the left side, and you can, it's basically just a checkbox. There's also an other column where you can put specific information in, but what this does is it allows us to see how many incidents have those types of exposures on them, and because our personnel are tied to the run, we can also look at individuals and their personal exposure. I'll have more on this later in Chapter 14 when we talk about basically the data reporting piece of it and doing personal exposure records. In Chapter 5, we have it's about training, education, and professional development. That's the title of the chapter. So here again, now we have a training requirement to be trained in the risks associated with workplace exposures to products of combustion, carcinogens, fireground contaminants, and other related health hazards. You should be trained to recognize when an exposure has occurred and know control methods for personal decontamination of protective clothing and equipment and risks of cross-contamination. So this obviously is huge when you think about everything that's impacted by not only this training but just the requirements to be able to address contamination control. And then there's the new section in Chapter 5 as well that addresses supervision and EMS training activities. So adding requirements for that. In Chapter 6, this is apparatus, equipment, and drivers, operators. In Chapter 6, so this is where this exterior riding position was addressed. This was a huge issue. We actually had days and days over the course of the revision cycle that were dedicated to this. We had people coming in from all over the country. We had letters from representatives and senators from the U.S. government that were speaking on behalf of constituents that were weighing in on this issue. But at the end of the day, a lot of back and forth. At the end of the day, the committee stood firm that we did not feel comfortable with exterior riding positions. So just for a little background, and this really doesn't affect any departments that I'm aware of in Ohio. There may be some departments that are doing some pump and roll with grass fires, but what this allowed in 1906, in the way that it was written, was that you could have an exterior riding position for wildland fires, and even with adding all kinds of safeguards that the manufacturers have tried to do, the committee was not comfortable with it because they weren't really validated, and it just was, a lot of it was human factor controls, and that you couldn't really put the safety measures in sitting on the outside of a vehicle. And there are pump and roll options in vehicles that allow you to stay in the cab and still roll and put the fire out. So there is no riding while the vehicle's in motion, with the exception of, as you'll see in 634, 635, and 636. And there's a little more detail in those when you look at them in the document, but during EMS care, to the extent possible, you are allowed to be unrestrained. Hose loading operations is permitted with an SOP that addresses how it shall be done, and the same with tiller training if you have a tractor trailer. And again, with an SOP in that case. So again, this was the pump and roll piece. Kind of covered that already for the most part, and just kind of reiterating it, but that's the outside position. Chapter 7 is your protective clothing and protective equipment chapter. So not a lot of changes in here, other than we did add a section that started to address the protective clothing and equipment for civil unrest and active violence incidents. So previously there was nothing in there. So we do have a requirement that you have appropriately sized body armor, and the standard that we reference for that is the National Institutes of Justice 3A standard. And that's for your body armor. If you are part of a rescue task force, and I'll get into that in the next slide, for an active violence incident, then you also currently we're requiring that you have a ballistic helmet, flashlight, medical gloves, and a radio with remote mic and earpiece is what's required in there. Some of this may get revisited, as you're all aware. This is rapidly evolving area for us, and it's also new for us. And so there's been some feedback on this, and so this whole section is going to be looked at again and see if we need to loosen some things up or tighten them up. But certainly the ballistic vests aren't going away. I wouldn't expect that to happen. Rescue Task Force, in case you're not familiar with what these are, is and this is one of the definitions. It's a resource comprised of fire department or EMS personnel, together with law enforcement, providing force protection assigned and deployed in a portion of the scene that does not pose an immediate threat to active violence, but has not been deemed to be free of all possible threats of violence, to provide life-saving interventions and rapid extrication of victims during an active violence incident. So, and this is a pretty standard definition for a rescue task force, or as you'll hear them called as RTFs, often. In that you will be going into the hot zone, but it's semi-controlled, and you are with law enforcement. Some other changes in the personal protective equipment piece is the fire department shall develop specific procedures for rapid extrication of a downed firefighter that involves the use of specific equipment worn by the firefighter. So as you may be aware, we have currently integrated into the PPE the DRD system, the direct rescue device. So that is still part of the NFPA 1851 standard, but it was recognized that not all firefighters may have access to that, and that there are other methods that firefighters may choose to use instead of the DRD. And so this basically says that you just have to develop with what you have. So the DRD is not optional at this time. I've heard talk that that may go that direction, but I haven't seen anything in the new editions or anything proposed coming forward. We added the requirement for SCBAs doing overhaul here. It's also covered in Chapter 14. So here we just specifically addressed SCBA in the section that talked about the SCBA use. Normally it said during IDLH, and now it's expanded to include the undefined environments such as overhaul. And then the post-fire use of an air purifying respirator, we cover that in Chapter 14. This addresses that it may be used under certain circumstances, and that's in Chapter 14. And we'll get into exactly what that looks like. It's a pretty limited use for the APR, and even at that, it's not the best option. But we felt this was a kind of a step in the right direction for us, and we'll see if APRs develop to be better used for overhaul, or if we just have to stay with supplied air. And as we get to that later on toward the end, and if you have any questions about that and the use of APRs, I'll be happy to take them. I can probably speak to that more extensively. This next one is kind of a big change for a lot of departments, and this is basically so the requirement is SCBA cylinders for structural firefighting shall have a minimum gas capacity of 1,699 liters of air. Granted, most people don't know what that translates into and what it means, but essentially we're phasing out the 30-minute rated cylinder. So a 30-minute rated cylinder is roughly around 1,200, between 12 and 1,300 liters of air, and it's rated at 30 minutes. But up to about 1,700 liters, it can be rated. So there are still some departments out there that have a SCBA that's a 3,000 psi. The 3,000 psi is a 1,699 liter cylinder. It's rated for 30 minutes, but it's very close to being a 45-minute rated cylinder, which is when you get closer to 1,800 liters of air is when NIOSH begins to certify them at 45 minutes. So this has been a long time coming, and this was actually kind of aligning with NFPA 1403, which is the respiratory training standard, and 1981, which is the SCBA standard. So 81 in the last edition, we added we changed the end of service life indicator, or the low air alarm, from 25%, where it used to be, to 33%, and further, in the last edition of 1500, we also added a reserve air requirement that you had to maintain some reserve air for emergencies, that it wasn't for exit, that it was if something happens to you that you have a reserve in your cylinder. And that was defined as 600 liters of air. And the 1403 standard addresses that as well. So all these three standards combined basically say that you have to leave at 33%, and at 33%, you should have about 600 liters of air, which is what a 45-minute cylinder or 45-minute rated cylinder has in it. I hope that wasn't too confusing, but this is kind of a big deal. Chapter 8, Emergency Operations. One requirement here: while operating in the hot or warm zone, personnel shall be equipped with a portable radio provided by the fire department. Obviously, this is long overdue for the fire services. It certainly is part of your PPE, and so the radio is now a requirement for every firefighter operating in the hot zone or warm zone. Crew resource management was added to the document, and that had again previously not been in there. This was something that the IAFC, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, pushed to have added to the document, and there is some annex language as well, defining it more and talking about what it is. So that is now part of it. This is another big deal here. Fire department shall meet the deployment requirements of NFPA 1710 and 1720. 1710 is for career departments, 1720 for volunteer departments. And that is, those are basically the staffing standard or the deployment requirements, how many firefighters you have to be able to assemble on the scene within, within a certain amount of minutes. BLS is a minimum level of emergency care at structure fires or special operations incidents is now defined. It wasn't defined as what level of standby care had to be there. And we also address fire investigators' protective clothing and equipment, and that basically says it has to be appropriate. We don't define exactly what that is, but they should have some sort of coverall or Tyvek suit. They wouldn't need, obviously, structural firefighter gear, but they should have some level of protective equipment for the hazards that they're being exposed to. The CRM, the definition of that, the crew resource management, is a program focused on improved situational awareness, sound critical decision making, effective communication, proper task allocation, and successful teamwork and leadership. And again, there's the IFC has a whole manual for it, and there's books on it as well. Rooftop photovoltaic equipment is added also in Chapter 8, and there is a section that deals with energized power sources, and this basically added the rooftop photovoltaics and certain requirements that should go along with it with regard to training, SOPs, mitigation, and operations. Hazard control zone. So this is, we've had hazard control zones addressed in here. It's kind of surprising, but really there was none of our documents had addressed collapse zones. And this had come up after a firefighter fatality, and we really weren't pointing to any collapse zone requirements. So we addressed what the collapse zone shall be, and it's equal to 1.5 times the height of the building, and this is pretty standard for the fire service. And it shall be a no entry zone. And so, and this is just a little video I have, but you can see a firefighter operating at a gas station. Fire here. There's a firefighter in right about the center of that circle, and when the video plays in a minute, you'll see, but the facade comes down on the firefighter. That firefighter actually ended up being okay, but again, it's risk versus benefit, something like this. So. Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! The definition of a collapse zone is the area that is exposed to trauma, debris, and or thrust should a building or part of a building collapse. And then rehab, which is surprising. So this is kind of interesting. So rehab originally, NFPA 1584, the rehab standard, originally was a chapter in 1500. They eventually moved it out of 1500, created its own document, but there was never a reference to 1584. And that's what 1500 does with just about everything, is they point to it. So we put that back in there. It now points to 1584 for rehabilitation, and we specify here, as well as in 1584, no more than 2 SCB cylinders should be used before going to rehab. So, and this is, the medical community, the OCMed docs that look at firefighters and do a lot of the research on this tend to feel that even 2 cylinders is a lot for structural firefighting activities because of the cardiac risk that we're exposed to, and that if firefighters are doing strenuous work, we probably ought to push them into rehab even sooner. So I imagine that's going to get looked at again. That is obviously a big challenge for a lot of departments. Granted, I work in Columbus. We have a lot of resources, but the rest of the state and the rest of the country doesn't really have necessarily the same number of resources. But this becomes a real challenge because of the cardiac and cancer both being the top 1 and 2 causes of preventable firefighter deaths. Active violence. Active violence incidents are now also addressed. We talked about the PPE earlier in the PPE chapter, but we talked about it in the operations as well. SOP shall cover unified command, annual training with law enforcement, common terminology, and secondary devices. So we're starting to address operations in here and how these incidents should go. And Chapter 9, which used to be part of the operations chapter, traffic incident management, is now its own chapter. So Chapter 9 is a new chapter. A lot of them in the material is updated. The traffic incident management criteria does update quite a bit. We tried to keep it nice and simple in here. There's whole manuals on how this should be performed, but and there's long classes on how it should be performed as well. But in the standard itself, it's pretty straightforward, right? So first off, fire department shall provide training on roadway hazards and safety for all personnel in accordance with NFPA 1091, which is the traffic control incident management standard qualification standard. And basically, when developing your SOPs, you should be collaborating, communicating, coordinating with our other response agencies, i.e. law enforcement, and basically for this incident response. So upstream, we have a new term in here, which is upstream and downstream traffic. Traffic that is entering or approaching the incident scene is upstream. Traffic that is departing or past the incident is downstream, and that's how basically TIMA or traffic incident management is set up. First riding apparatus shall be placed in a blocking position in order to protect the scene and create a safe work zone for oncoming traffic. One, to establish what they call a temporary traffic incident management area once this zone's set up. Apparatus that are blocking shall reduce their warning lighting. It used to say, the requirement used to be for amber only. They've taken that out because not all departments were capable of that, but reducing the lighting, they found, will actually reduce the number of secondary accidents. Obviously, as the blocking vehicle, you would still need to have some lighting for oncoming traffic. But when everything is going on the scene, you end up having a lot of traffic. Even the other lanes of travel, if it's a divided highway, tend to have accidents. All additional responding vehicles shall be positioned downstream from the blocking vehicle with warning lighting reduced unless their function requires placement before the temporary control zone. And ambulances or transport vehicles shall be positioned in a safe location to allow patient loading away from traffic. So this is what it should look like, and this is in the document, and there's even more in the annex on this. But basically, from the left to right, you've got you've got your warning devices, your blocking, you've got a buffer in the case of the ladder there, the accident, the loading zone for the EMS, and the termination area where you're leaving the scene. Speaking of auto accidents, high visibility garments. Basically, we've been doing that for a while here in Ohio and nationally. There is an exemption in the federal law that allows you to that if you could potentially be exposed to heat, flame, or hazardous materials, where turnout gear is acceptable. If you're not going to be doing active, if you're not holding a hose line or doing work which may expose you to heat, flame, then you should be wearing a vest. In Chapter 11, which is the medical and physical requirements, So here, and this basically, really points you to NFPA 1582 for the most part. We don't talk about all the requirements in here, but it does talk that you should have a 1582 physical. Also, and this is the new stuff here with confidentiality, the individual health file shall be separate from the personal or HR file, and shall be made in accordance with ADA, FMLA, and the 29 CFR 1910 for toxic and hazardous substances. So that's new in there. Also in this right now, what I'm showing you, this slide, this is actually in NFPA 1582. I get a lot of questions on it. People want to know about cancer screening and cancer and prevention requirements. So this is actually from 1582, the current edition, what types of cancer screening trainings are required. Not all of these are new. Most of these are actually have been in there for years, but basically we require screening for skin, colon, prostate, lung, cervical, oral, thyroid, testicular, and bladder cancers. We also have an addition in this to the new edition, to the 2018 edition of 1582. We added a physician consult on cardiovascular and cancer risk. It says in 1582, it says the fire department physician shall annually inform members of the heightened risks of cardiovascular diseases and various types of cancer associated with firefighting and the routes of exposure, of hazardous exposure related to firefighting, as well as common signs, symptoms, and preventative measures from both cardiovascular diseases and cancer. So now we're actually having a discussion with our firefighters about this from the medical professional as well. Chapter 12 is the Behavioral Health and Wellness Program chapter, and this has also been getting a lot of attention nationally and here in Ohio. So there's more of a push for including prevention and resilience in this. So these two requirements are new. The fire department shall provide access to a program to assist members in creating personal resiliency to stress and traumatic exposures. So adopting a resiliency program and doing resiliency training is now something that we should be doing. And fire departments should provide access to a program that supports or enhances the behavioral health and wellness through leadership development and organizational group dynamics evaluation and training. And again, the emphasis here is on prevention. Chapter 13, occupational exposure to atypical stressful events. Again, this changed 2 editions ago. 2 editions ago, it changed from PTSD, or I'm sorry, from critical incident stress management to this to occupational exposure to atypical stressful events, because it was recognized that there were other that CISM wasn't always the best method. A lot of research from the military, and that we just wanted to address this appropriately, and so we don't prescribe the CISM method necessarily anymore. There's a much wider variety of options available, and CISM, while it has its merits and works well in some cases, it could be counterproductive and can do harm in others. The fire department shall maintain a relationship with an appropriately licensed and or certified behavioral health specialist, as defined by the by NFPA 1582. And the behavioral health specialist held knowledge and experience working with fire department culture and traumatic exposure, and that's again a really important piece of this. We've heard from many clinicians and researchers and experts in the field where we've heard stories relayed from firefighters who go seek counseling or seek help, and their clinicians are not prepared for what they're going to hear. Is that the firefighters, and they're talking about their experiences, what they're seeing, the clinicians on the couch crying, and so being able to address this more appropriately is certainly the direction we're trying to head into. Chapter 14, this is the big one here, exposure to fireground toxic contaminants. If you haven't seen this slide or this picture up here, what you're looking at is the results from what's called a FAST test, which is a fluorescent aerosol screening test that was performed a couple years ago. And what it is, essentially, I won't go into too much on it, but basically they put a firefighter in full PPE on air, working in an environment that is that has basically some wind or positive pressure in it, and it's got fluorescent particles in it that are ultrafine microparticles between 0.01 and I believe 10 microns. 1 micron is like a tenth of the width of a human hair. So they're really tiny bits we're talking about here, but the area is charged, and this is the kind of stuff that causes cancer, that goes through our gear, that's exposed to us on our skin. And so the firefighter's doing work for about, I believe it's 20 minutes, and then they have a before and after shot. And what you're seeing is the ingress of these particles. So anywhere it's lit up is where you're seeing it. Now, if you, in some of the other photos, you can see the firefighter's face, you can see their legs, and basically anywhere there's an interface, we're having ingress of toxic contaminants. And so that's something that we should be looking at with the specifications of our PPE, and manufacturers are looking to better address as well. And the neck, as you can see, at least the upper part of the photo, the neck, the back of the head, all the areas that are exposed through the hood, it's going right through those areas and getting onto our skin, even through your even through your station wear that you have on. So because none of those have barrier protection. Definition for fireground contaminants is obviously this was the first thing we battled over for quite a while, trying to come up what are these things, what are we talking about here. So we tried to cover a pretty broad range. We defined it as airborne, dermal, ocular, or respiratory hazards consisting of products of combustion, carcinogens, toxic chemicals, and ultrafine particles, and other incidental health hazards. So it pretty much covers the whole gamut. Then throughout the chapter, we start to address the first thing is training. The AHA shall provide training on the hazards associated with exposures to fireground toxic contaminants, including awareness, prevention, mitigation, and risk factors. Prevention and mitigation. The AHA shall provide standard operating procedures related to the prevention and mitigation of firefighter exposures to fireground toxic contaminants. And you know, what a great picture there. And this is, you know, the kids come to the firehouse, or we see them and they're all over us, they're touching our gear, we put our gear on them. In many departments, people are still taking their gear to bed, and we're having huge issues with cross-contamination. So we need, obviously, training is a big piece of this in creating awareness for the firefighter that, you know, that their gear is now, it now has hazmat all over it. You know, we wouldn't do that with anything else, but yet we treat suits and other products of combustion, which are known carcinogens, very casually. Cleaning and maintenance. The AHA shall provide for cleaning and maintenance of protective clothing and equipment. That is something that is, you know, we've added to the document. And the AHA shall ensure that soiled or contaminated protective clothing equipment is removed from service until cleaned and disinfected in accordance with NFPA 1851. So I would expect that in the next edition you're going to see this even tightened up further. It may seem vague or ambiguous. It's not intended to be that way. But basically the second bullet point there is saying, listen, when you're on the scene and your gear is contaminated, and it is, it needs to be removed from service immediately. Right? We don't say immediately there, but it needs to be. Obviously, that's the intent here, is that it's contaminated. You take it out of service just like you would anything else that would be contaminated, and not use it again. And so this creates a real challenge for fire departments to find types of solutions that can prevent us from continuing to use the gear, to cross-contaminate it, bring it in our trucks, and back to our firehouses. So again, this is probably the biggest challenge for departments to figure out, that we're not already doing something to deal with it. Second sense isn't always the answer. It may be the answer for your department, but really there may be other creative solutions. At the end of the day, the goal here is that firefighters are not wearing or cross-contaminating, dirty gear after a fire. That we're containing it on the scene, and we're dealing with it back at the firehouse or somewhere else. 14.4, mitigation of fireground toxic contaminant exposure. Appropriate protective clothing and equipment shall be worn during all phases of fireground operation, so no more overhaul in the t-shirt. Respiratory protective equipment, or shall during overhaul shall consist of a supplied air respirator, which is basically an SCBA, unless you had an SAR, supplied air respirator, which was with a hose. But I've heard departments looking at that, trying to do it. It seems kind of clunky. Plus, you probably have your firefighters working too long on a respirator. I mean, if it's the bottle is a good measure or a good mechanism to be able to gauge how long your firefighters are working. And then we address the APR, the air purifying respirator use in the post-fire environment. So here are the requirements, right? You can use an APR in the post-fire environment, and this is really directed toward the investigators, right? As long as it's greater than 30 minutes post-extinguishment, there's no active overhaul taking place, positive pressure ventilation is in place, and that you're doing continuous air monitoring for cyanide and CO, and that they're below the NIOSH levels of 4.7 for cyanide and 35 parts per million for CO. So, and we go further, actually. So first off, you can use an APR, but what does it have? You can't just use a paper filter or a P100. It has to have a chemical cartridge that's NIOSH approved to provide protection against atmospheres containing particulates, acid gases, organic vapors, and formaldehyde. Generally, this is a WMD type cartridge, and they can be kind of costly. They're probably in the neighborhood of $35 to $40 a piece. And that you also have to establish a filter change-out schedule for the environmental hazards present at each incident. Now, that is really difficult to do because every incident is different, and we probably have to look at a better way to do this. But the intent here was that you couldn't just use a cartridge over and over, and that there is no end of service time indicator other than creating a change-out schedule based on what you know. That may be by measuring certain gases or assuming certain things are present in the environment. In a couple studies that had been done, one of them in Arizona, looking at it, one of the areas they saw the breakthrough was formaldehyde. Was that formaldehyde levels were very high during the post-fire phase, and even without overhaul taking place, that the off-gassing is producing high levels of formaldehyde. So post-incident fireground toxic contaminant exposure, the AHA shall train its members on the proper doffing and containment of contaminated protective clothing and equipment, including prevention of cross-contamination. The AHA shall provide standard operating procedures related to the documentation of firefighters exposed to fireground toxic contaminants. And the AHA shall provide appropriate decontamination facilities and equipment for firefighters exposed to fireground toxic contaminants. So again, this covers a lot. Each one of these, the devil's in the details, and it becomes a real challenge to be able to implement and make these things happen. But this is really, again, we're trying to address one of our most significant exposures and the high rate of cancer that firefighters are having. So really important topic here. Personal hygiene following exposure. Initially, we're recommending wiping skin areas and their interfaces of protective clothing and equipment with wet wipes immediately after doffing. You could use soap and water on the scene. You could use a towel that's wet with soaping. There are other options, but you should be doing something to wipe the areas immediately after doffing. And then, a soap and water shower within an hour of the incident where an exposure could have occurred. And a lot of discussion back and forth whether it should be a hot shower or a cold shower or a combination and things like that. That is, we kind of stayed out of that mess. It should be a soap and water shower. There's not a whole lot of evidence to support these theories that going hot first or cold first makes that much of a difference. At the end of the day, it's getting the stuff off you. I mean, the soap is important to help get it off you as well. And so that's the important piece here. Something else I don't have in the slide here, but I get a question about this very regularly, and just about every time I do the presentation, is about sauna use. So there's always a lot of there's literature out there, and there's a lot of sales folks out there trying to sell saunas for firefighters, and all the research on this subject really comes from the sauna industry, saying that that a sweating detox is the best way to get rid of these contaminants. There is no peer-reviewed research that I'm aware of that I've seen that supports this theory or negates it for that matter. So it really, everything out there again comes from the sauna industry. But the industrial hygienists, the occupational med docs, and the researchers for firefighter cancer or firefighter cardiac death and injury are very concerned about the use of saunas. Basically, that 24 to 48-hour period post-fire is a very critical period for a cardiac event. Firefighting is a very stressful, hardworking activity, and because of the sweating and the heat, our plasma levels are increased. And so that is one of the things that they believe is a significant contributing factor to a cardiac event post-fire. And so going into a sauna and sweating things out more, further dehydrating and can actually be counterproductive. It's not recommended. The IFF has a position paper on this, and they're not recommending the use of saunas at this time. And interestingly, the New York Times had a story just earlier this year. Basically, the saunas work for detox. If you Google that, you'll see it. And in the first paragraph, basically, they say no. Exposure reporting. HJ shall establish an exposure reporting system for its members to use to record possible exposures to fireground toxic contaminants, so on and so forth. It shall be maintained by the HJ for at least 15 years following the member's separation from the HJ. So 15 years following separation, or until the death of the member, whichever occurs first. Members shall have access to their personal exposure records, and all personnel potentially exposed to fireground toxic contaminants shall complete an exposure report. So, we've always had one mechanism or another. Departments have tried to offer something to do this, but it has to be a little more formalized now in how it's maintained as well. This is not in the standard, but I wanted to kind of cover the direction that I see this going, and this is I put this as kind of a proposal. One is this, and it's basically that we have two levels of exposure reporting. We have the incident exposure report, which would be completed as part of the fire reporting system, whether it's the NFPAs or N4s, which is the National Fire Operations Reporting System, which is an optional program that I have a little bit of information on here in a couple slides. But that's what I was showing you. This was the Columbus form. This is what the result looked like earlier. But basically, during this incident, we're going to the following hazards present. So what this does is it captures incident data for us and even ties it to individuals over certain exposures. And then level 2 would be your personal exposure record, right? You don't have to do a personal exposure record on every incident, but you probably want to do it when you have a significant or gross exposure. It could be triggered that you do it after certain types of incidents, based on the call type or the disposition. And N4s, is an excellent vehicle for this. So this is the N4s. It's part of the Fire Cares program, which is a larger AFG grant looking at collecting data. So this can tie into your CAD basically and gives you a lot of incident data and risk rating. It's a pretty big program. So if you're not familiar with it, you can go online and you can look up N4s and see a lot of information about what it does and how to get it in your department. But they do have an exposure module, and actually the way it works, because if it's tied to your department's to your staffing module, or if your N4s has personnel assigned to it, which it should. Basically, after they have an incident, it could push them to they can sign up for it, and it can push directly to their smartphone or computer. An email, it could send them do they want to fill out an exposure report for that incident? And it even looks at mental health exposures. And one of the last things I want to cover is just some things happening with the standards here, that we've basically realigned the standards in the Occupational Safety and Health Committee. They were kind of all over the place because things have moved forward and back over the years, and they wanted to kind of get them aligned. So we have 3 safety standards. It's 1500, 1561, and 1521, and you can see what they are there. Incident management, command safety, fire department safety officer, and then 1500, which we're talking about. These are all moving to 2019, to fall 2019, and so for some, like 1561, it's adding a year to it, but as you see in 1500, it's going from 5 years normal revision cycle to 2.5 years. So again, we have a current edition out right now that just came out, but we are right back into revision. It's actually open for public comment until I believe January 4th, I think is the date, but it might be sooner than that. So if you want to add comment or seek changes to the document, you have the opportunity to do that now for the first draft. And then the health and wellness standards, which are the medical program, infection control program, your fitness program, and the rehab, all move over to the fall 2020, which would be a 2021 standard is what it would be. And those 2 are open for public comment. We haven't started working on them, and they'll be open for about another year. 2 projects that are going on, or that were involved in this, was a cleaning validation project by the NFPA Research Foundation. And just really quick, one slide here. The goal of the project is to determine how clean is clean. And basically looking at what's left in your gear after you wash it. Obviously, this begs the question of how soil is contaminated, which is, the real challenge to determining what's contaminated on the scene is, what do you use as parameters, and I can take some questions to that. It's obviously a longer discussion. But currently, there's no industry standards that conclusively and reliably show that clothing is being adequately cleaned. This was a 3-year project. It's due to be finished next year. And it's been funded by the AFG program as well. And then there was the Campaign for Fire Service Contamination Control. This was a 1-year program, and they just issued the report about a week ago. I got a copy of it. If you go to the NFPA Research Foundation website, if you Google that, or you go to the NFPA and you go to the Research Foundation, the report should be sitting in there. Is what's released, and it's basically just looking to establish best practices. Is what this project was aimed at. So what's next? Again, 1500 continues to evolve as the umbrella document for occupational safety and health. 1584, we're looking to do a complete overhaul of that document and to really expand it, not just to be rehab, but to be the decon portion of it. So it's basically, what do you do post-fire? You come out and now you're going to go through some sort of decon and rehab process. So that's going to be a big part of that, is how that evolves to define it. But the standards have a process, and they do lag behind what we're doing. So departments shouldn't be waiting for 1584 to determine how to deal with decontamination. That's it's currently a requirement of 1500, and I expect we'll probably roll more into 1500 in anticipation that we can then roll that into 1584. Again, looking to look at contamination control, post-fire hygiene, cross-contamination, on-scene decon, station-level decon, as well as rehab. And then 1581, which is the infection control program, there is public comment being accepted on this right now, whether to create a new document for contamination control or to roll it into NFPA 1581. And 1581 would be expanded to be both infection control and contamination control, which they're very closely aligned. This right now, 1500 and 1581 are the only 2 documents that address vehicles or living areas and station design. And so, again, it would be a good way for us to address that. There is no station standard or station design standard. And then who else addresses contamination control? Obviously all the protective clothing and equipment, selection, care, and maintenance, that's what SCAM stands for, should address decon, cleaning, and care following typical fireground exposures. They deal with their own area of how to do it and when to do it. The
The performance and design documents, so like NFPA 1971, which is the PPE standard, would address contamination controls where appropriate. So it may be with interfaces and other ways, other areas as far as performance and design. There may be requirements you'll see evolving in that. A lot of these things really haven't been addressed yet. They're kind of working on what is the best way to do it. The protocol documents, the professional qualification documents, will establish training requirements. And training documents should address training requirements for awareness, prevention, mitigation, and control of these hazards. So that's all I have for you right now. I mean, that was quite a bit. And we will take some questions. I have one question that was raised earlier that I see already. Basically, with a question about should departments be buying 45-minute cylinders for any new purchases? And the answer to that is yes. We should not be buying 30-minute. If you want to be in compliance with NFPA 1500, if you want to provide your firefighters with a reserve air requirement, if you purchase a 30-minute cylinder number one, you'd be in violation of 1500, where we say you have to, for structural firefighting, has to be above 1699. And we're specific about it for structural firefighting because the Navy, who's one of the largest consumers of SCBA, uses a 30-minute cylinder for shipboard firefighting, but that works into their operations. And so we kind of kept the 30-minute as an option if you were not doing structural firefighting or if you did a risk assessment. But new purchases should absolutely be looking at 45-minute rated cylinders because if you're going to have the reserve air requirement of 600 liters, then in a 30-minute rated cylinder, which is again right around 1,200 liters, at 50%, not at 33%, but at 50%, you actually have to be out of the structure. Are there any other questions? I believe you're able to raise your hand or type them in.
Right now, it looks like the only other question is if this webinar will be available to share with others. And yes, we will be posting this on our YouTube channel, hopefully later today, and we will send out a notice that it's up there for you. So.
Okay, well, again, thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening and tuning in. My contact information is on the screen right now. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions or anything you need related to this stuff, or even if you're interested in knowing how to submit comment to the NFPA for any of these documents or another document, I'll help you through the process. I've been doing this committee work for a number of years, and it could be a little daunting if you haven't done it before. So I'm always there to help. Have a good day.
Thanks everybody for being here.